Hey guys, Buildzoid here, and this is just going to be kind of an experiment to see if this might be worth doing or might not be worth doing. But basically, if you've been following me on Facebook, Hardware Bot, or if you visit the community tab on the YouTube channel, then you may have noticed that I recently managed to get some pretty high scores for 3Dmark Vantage, triple GPU and quad GPU. Got fourth place for both of those categories. And yeah, basically I'm going to talk about the process of doing that because that wasn't a live stream, which I'm really thankful for, because if I tried to live stream that, I would have probably given up like halfway through. Because I ended up, like, what I ended up running, I think I ran through something like 40 liters of liquid nitrogen. Yeah, the session lasted, I don't know, I think like 8 hours total. I actually went to sleep at one point, like I ran up until like 3 a.m. in the morning, then I went to sleep, and then the next day I continued. But until I, finally got the scores that I wanted to see, because at 3 a.m. what I was getting was like I had a good GPU score and I had a good CPU score, but I hadn't managed to like get them to go together yet. So then it was just like 2 more hours to get those two scores to sort of like each other. Which you might be like, how's that so difficult to do? Well, it's multi-GPU is always problematic. Well, it's actually not so much the multi-GPU part. It's more like if you're benching on LN2, you just run into issues that you didn't even know were possible to run into. So anyway, this is just going to be kind of a summary of the whole process, which summaries are supposed to be short, but we all know that I don't do short, so get ready. So let's first talk about the benchmark. So the benchmark is, of course, 3Dmark Vantage. And what you need to know about 3Dmark Vantage is that it's old. It's DirectX 10. It released for Windows Vista, if I remember correctly, which is where it gets the V, V Vantage for V Vista. So yeah, that is where the name came from. 3Dmark 11 is from DirectX 11, if I'm not mistaken. Or the year. I'm not sure about that one. 3Dmark 11 might have been 2011, or it might have been because it was the first 3Dmark for DirectX 11. It might have been both, honestly. But anyway, so Vantage is DirectX 10, which on AMD GPU setups, which is what I ran with I ran on Fiji. We're just going to say Fiji in general because it was 2 Fury X's and 2 Furies, so just Fiji cards. Because it's not 4 of 1 card, it's a kind of it's a mix. AMD is nice like that. You can mix and match cards of the same core. So like you can mix any Tahiti with any other Tahiti. So you can like take a 7950 and run it with a 7970, or you can even take a 7870 XT, which really I think should have been called the 7930. And run that thing with the 7970. And like those are complete, like one of those has a 256-bit memory bus and 2 gigs of VRAM, and the other one has a 3840 and 3 gigs of VRAM. Yeah, those still work together because they're still based off of the Tahiti core. So AMD is cool like that. It's like, if it is it built with Fiji, you can run it together in Crossfire. Great. So yeah, I had 4 Fiji cards, but the problem with running AMD cards in DirectX 10 benchmarks is that you can't do much in the way of tweaks. The LOD doesn't work, LOD being level of detail, which basically, level of detail is a setting that allows you to basically lower the detail level of your textures. And the idea why this exists is that if you have textures far away, if you're in a game world and there's some textures really far away, then you don't need to render them at full detail. The thing is, that setting is scalable, so you can actually tell it to render all textures at very low detail, even if they're like right in front of you, which is great because it removes a whole bunch of texture data and it makes the benchmark run faster. Well, not a whole lot faster, but it does give you some, couple percent gains for 3D benchmarking. The problem is, on AMD GPUs, LOD only works on DirectX 9 or older. And if you go with, and then, you might be like, oh, but the other tweak we can do on HWBot for, benchmarks is you can disable tessellation. Yeah, except DirectX 10 doesn't do tessellation the way DirectX, well, I'm not sure it does tessellation at all. Like like that it's not actually like it's not an inherent feature of DirectX 10. But basically, the whole disabling tessellation through the AMD driver doesn't work for DirectX 10 benchmarks. So you can't do that either, and you're kind of stuck with just running Vantage the way it was meant to be run, at least on the GPU side. So it's kind of annoying if you're on an AMD graphics card. So, and then the other thing you need to know about Vantage is that it only goes up to 16 threads. And if you give it too many threads, it will score worse. So I was running this on X299, which is why I have an X299 Dark sitting behind me, and with the 7940X. The 7940X, if you have hyperthreading enabled, has 28 threads. I don't know where the bug out limit for Vantage is, but 28 threads is definitely above it, because if you go and turn off hyperthreading, the physics score for any given, like at a fixed frequency, your physics score when you kill hyperthreading jumps up a huge amount. And if you're on like a 7960X or a 7980XE, you would still want to disable hyperthreading. Now, 7980XEs are interesting because like I've seen people bench them with both 18 cores and 16 cores, so I don't know if it's like a personal choice that some people disable the last 2 cores and some people don't bother. So I don't know. Like, I'm not sure what the deal is up with that, but for the 7940X, it's definitely like, I don't have enough cores. The benchmark goes all the way up to 16 cores. 16 cores is roughly 15% more cores than 14 cores, so I need all the cores I can get, but I don't necessarily want to have a million threads, because I just need 16, well, ideally you want 16 very, very, very fast threads. I have a maximum access of 14. Because the other option is that I run like, I don't know, if I ran it in like 10 core mode, I'd have 10 full threads and then like 10 fake threads. And it doesn't really work like that, but that's one way you can think about it, because a hyperthread is worth roughly 30% of a core in a workload that works with it properly. In a workload that doesn't work well with hyperthreading, you can actually end up losing performance. So, but anyway, so with the 7940X, you kill hyperthreading for 3Dmark Vantage because you have too many damn cores. And the benchmark doesn't need them. So that's the benchmark there. It's relative, like it needs a lot of cores, but it doesn't need a ton. It doesn't need a million of them. Like 3Dmark Firestrike goes up to like 32 threads. And if you go past 3Dmark Firestrike, TimeSpy is supposed to go up to like 64 threads or something ridiculous like that. So, yeah, just, awesome. Like, yeah, at least benchmarks will always be capable of making full use of your completely overpowered CPUs. That's always nice to have. But Vantage, being an older benchmark, obviously wasn't designed for, the ridiculous core counts that we're seeing today. So Vantage was designed only up to 16 threads. And that's, so yeah, that was basically the benchmark. Now then, let's talk about the system I ran it on. So this is a picture of the system right here. And what you're looking at is, so under all of that is a EVGA X299 Dark motherboard, and that was running on the latest extreme overclocking BIOS, and that new BIOS is actually really great. So yeah, that new BIOS is awesome. It doesn't include like the Spectre patches or anything like that. It's actually on a really old revision of microcode, because if you actually run the new official BIOSes on liquid nitrogen, what you'll notice is if you set your VCCIO voltage high enough, it actually completely sends system stability to hell. So you need to run the extreme overclocking BIOS, otherwise you're completely screwed, because you go below 0 with high VCCIO and high VCCSA, and everything just craps out completely. And the problem is you need a lot of VCCIO if you want the mesh. If you want the mesh to clock high, you need a lot of VCCIO. So yeah, that was the X299 Dark on the latest extreme overclocking BIOS. For the memory, I was running the usual 4 sticks of 8 gigabyte sticks from Team Group, the T-Force Extremes. that they've kindly provided me with. Those are rated for 3733 CL18, but my kits were actually like binned by hand, so they're not just your run-of-the-mill sort of retail kits. They're a bit special. But I do have 4 of those sticks, and those were running. Those are Samsung B-Die, and those were running. I was running like I did get them. Like the new BIOS is actually really impressive because I had them booting all the way at like 4040 megahertz, 12, 12, 12, 28 or 26. Unfortunately, that never managed. Like I never managed to stabilize that fully, so I ended up actually benching at like 3813 megahertz or something like that. Which I'm gonna like the memory kit should be able to stabilize 40, 40, 12, 12, 12. The problem is the X299 Dark just doesn't physically have the ability to change the VTT DDR voltage slash VREF, depending on which one, like, you know, which side of the coin you want to look at. So you can't change that voltage on the Dark. It has to be half VDDR. And the problem is my memory kit will scale past 2 volts on the VDIM, but it will complain if the VTT DDR exceeds 1.95. So basically, I can't really ultimately I ended up running at 1.95 VDIM because too much VDIM and the memory kit just doesn't like it will not be stable. Like it'll post and everything, but it just won't be stable. So that I had to give up on the 4000 CL12 speed. I could have maybe loosened out the cast latency and run like 13, 12, 12, 12, but at the time it was like I don't know. I need to test if that actually makes any sense to do. With quad channel, the thing is with quad channel you have so much memory bandwidth just because there's 4 memory channels that you're normally going to run into latency issues first. Like you should on quad channel you would generally prioritize timings over frequency just because you're for most workloads you're going to have way more than enough bandwidth. There are some workloads which would typically be things based on like say AVX which would benefit from extra bandwidth, but this is 3Dmark Vantage. It doesn't even use hyperthreading. So you know, went with 3813 or something like that. Oh yeah, no, 3838 and 3860 I want to say. Because I actually ran slightly different BCLKs for 3845 for the 4-way setup, and that was with 12, 11, 11, 28, 1T at 1.95 VDIM. So that's the memory. Now the rest of the setup was VCC in. I was running 2.3 volts to 2.4 volts, and there's a reason why it was a range and not a set voltage. And then for vCore, I was running 1.55 to 1.58 volts. There's a reason why it's a range, not a set voltage. And like this was override voltage. Like this was static voltage. I had VDroop disabled. So this is kind of a complaint I have for EVGA, but it's not like a huge issue. EVGA doesn't do your usual multiple LLC levels. I'm not sure if it's because they decided that it doesn't actually make any sense to do that, or if it's just expensive to do. But ultimately, if you basically have VDroop on, and when you turn VDroop on, you have Intel spec VDroop, or if you turn VDroop off, you have no VDroop. So that's kind of that. So I ran it with no VDroop, and the VDroop on an X299 motherboard actually only applies to the VCC in VRM because that's the only one that has a VDroop. That's the only one that has droop configured by the CPU. So you can turn that on and off because the actual core voltage is controlled by a voltage regulator built into the CPU. And as far as I'm aware, that one may or may not have a load. I don't think it has a load line. Because the way the fully integrated voltage regulator works is it's an extremely high switching frequency buck converter built directly into the CPU. So the main issue that load line is supposed to counteract, the Fiverr wouldn't really have. So I don't think there's load line on that. But unfortunately, like getting the actual official document describing how the fully integrated voltage regulator works if I'm not mistaken, that document is behind a paywall, or at least the last time I came across it, it was. So yeah, I've not managed to get I've not been able to, get my hands on it and read the whole thing. So that's kind of unfortunate. But anyway, V droop off, VCC in 2.3 volts to 2.4, V core 1.55, 1.58, and the fiver doing whatever it actually does with the V core at under load. VMesh at 1.42 volts. VMesh is again generated by the fully integrated voltage regulator. VCCIO was at 1.35 volts because you need that high VCCIO for high mesh frequency. And I was actually managing to run the mesh at like 3.8 to 3.9 gigahertz. It might have even gone higher, except the problem was I was having massive issues towards the end of the session when I was really starting to max out the entire system. I was having issues with things coming and going at random. And more mesh frequency made the memory very, very temperamental about working. In fact, I don't think I ever had all 4 memory channels working at the same time as I had 3.9 gigahertz mesh. So, I basically ran 3.8 gigahertz mesh, which is still a big improvement over the previous BIOS, because on the previous BIOS, I had to run like 1.1 volts VCCIO, and with that, you only get like 3.5 to 3.6 gigahertz mesh. And obviously the 3.6 side of that was kind of unstable compared to the 3.5 gigahertz. So 1.35 volts VCCIO, but the VCCSA is kind of interesting because the VCCSA, for whatever reason, I had to run it at 1.05 volts or the system literally wouldn't even it would post and it would go into the BIOS, but there was no chance I was getting into Windows. It would just blue screen and throw memory errors and freak out at random. So actually really low VCCSA, and similarly the system agent offset, which is actually a separate voltage, which not all motherboards have, I don't think. I'm not sure about it, but I do remember somebody messaging me about memory overclocking on X299, and basically system agent offset voltage on the X299 Dark is like the memory overclocking voltage. Like that is the VCCIO doesn't do a damn thing for memory overclocking. VCCSA doesn't do a damn thing for memory overclocking. System agent offset, that voltage right there makes the difference between doing, 3800 CL12 and not posting 3800 megahertz at any timings whatsoever. So, but even that voltage, on liquid nitrogen, you actually have to run it kind of low. On air cooling, I've run it between sort of 400 and I think 500, plus 400 to plus 500 millivolts. On liquid nitrogen, I was running it at only plus 350, which is just kind of a liquid nitrogen weirdness thing, I guess, with the X299 CPUs. Their memory controller seems to be really overly sensitive in a lot of ways. So yeah, those were the settings. Now, the CPU, once I was really maxing it out, because I was topping out at around, 5.66 gigahertz. When I got to that point with the 3800 CL12 memory and the 3800 megahertz mesh speed, I ran into this very interesting issue. The CPU would drop cores and it would drop memory channels, and it wasn't the memory failing to initialize, because the motherboard has like LEDs for indicating if your memory was trained properly, and it would train all the memory sticks properly, and then the memory controller would just drop it for whatever reason. So there was like one of the memory sticks would just never, ever stay posted, which was really, really annoying, because you would get all the way into Windows and then it'd be like, oh yeah, you have triple channel instead of quad channel, which in a benchmark like 3Dmark Vantage, where I'm actually fighting with I have a core count disadvantage, right? Because for the 4-way world record, they were using a 7980XE, so it would really be helpful if I had every little bit of CPU performance I could get. So running with 3 memory channels, not really an option. It's like, I'd rather have 4, because it makes a very small difference, right? But it's still a difference, and I want it. Because every little bit helps at this point. So ultimately, I ended up running my 4-way benchmark with 3 memory channels, because it was just like, because I also ran into issues with the CPU's core dropping out. So my CPU will literally not run more than 11 cores if you set the CPU ratio to 5.7 gigahertz. It just drops the last 3 cores. For whatever reason, core 12, I'm not sure if they're actually core 12, 13, 14, but basically there's 3 cores on the CPU. Now, if I set the multiplier to 57 and I save changes and reset, boots with 11 cores. And the system would actually still do the boot with 11 cores at like 5.66 gigahertz. And it was just like, you basically, the only way to get, like, if the system did that, the only way to get it to actually properly initialize those extra cores was to fiddle with the voltages a bit, right, and tell it to save and reset, and then fiddle with, and then maybe if I got lucky, the cores came back, but I might lose a memory channel every time I did that. So it was just like like towards the end of my, when I was really like the last several hours trying to get the scores, was basically me just sitting there and trying to get the CPU to initialize properly. And then once it initialized properly, finish Vantage. So it was a nightmare at that point, because it was just like, oh yeah, we got into Windows, but I have 13 cores, because at 5.66 gigahertz, it would, like, sometimes it would drop all the way down to 11 cores, but more often than not, it would just be one core that didn't make it. So, I had to change the vCore up and down and VCC in up and down until, on a lucky boot, I had all 14 cores running, which was just like, great, awesome. So now I have one chance to do 3Dmark Vantage, and if this crashes, I'm going to have to, like, spend several, who knows how long trying to get the CPU to reinitialize properly again. So that was great. But eventually I did it. I had 3 memory channels and a 14-core CPU with 5.66 gigahertz on it, and I ran with it. So yeah, and then for my 3-way record, I actually ran 5.65. Because I got sick and tired of the CPU just dropping everything at random. So I dropped the BCLK a bit and just ran with 5.65, 56 megahertz, because I was just sick and tired at that point of the CPU just dropping cores, because, like, that was burning a lot of liquid nitrogen, because this thing does not idle. Like, it doesn't idle particularly cold, and Windows boot up is actually, there's a decent amount of load it puts on the system. So, yeah, and the other thing is for temperatures, since we were on liquid nitrogen, that was the other thing. The CPU had weird, like, cold boot up issues. Like, if I tried to boot it at minus 60 degrees, it would almost always drop cores. Almost always. If I booted at minus 60, I would lose some cores. If I booted at minus 55, I would have all of my cores. If I booted at minus 70, I would sometimes have most of my cores. But at minus 60, it was really bad. Like, every time I tried to boot minus 60, it was just like, oh, we go into all the cores are gone. Actually, I think it dropped all the way to 10 cores once even. So it was just like, yeah, the CPU just hates, like, the CPU just sucks as far as I'm concerned. Like, this one's a really bad sample, because the cores won't even post 5.7 gigahertz. No wonder they won't run benchmarks at that speed, right? It's like, so, yeah, lovely chip. It also complains about temperatures. Once you start getting up into the clock speeds, it starts complaining about temperatures more and more. So for actual, like, when I actually got it to boot up, and once I was running benchmarks, I was running sort of between minus 95 degrees Celsius and minus 85 degrees Celsius on the LN2 pot. So, yeah. Which is just kind of, like, it's not great. But the thing is, if I tried to run that same CPU on dry ice, I'm 99% sure I could not have gotten anywhere near what I actually did, because, yeah, it would be running about, 20, 30, maybe even 40 degrees warmer, because the problem with dry ice is you also have an interface fluid. So it's like dry ice itself might be pretty damn cold, but once it gets through the interface fluid and through the LN2 pot, it's not that cold anymore. So liquid nitrogen just, you'd think dry ice gives you minus 76, but under load, you're not going to get minus 76. You're going to get like minus 65 or something. Or minus 70. It really depends on how much heat you're throwing into it and, what size pellets you're running. Like, dry ice is a bit of a mess on the minimum temperature side. So, but with the liquid nitrogen, you have proper temperature control. So, but it's still not ideal, because liquid nitrogen goes to minus 196, and here I am, paddling along at minus 95, because the CPU freaks out if you go below that. As in, it gets really unstable if it goes any colder. It has a cold boot bug at minus 95 as well. So if the system crashed at like minus 9, well, Yeah, if the system crashed at like minus 96, it wouldn't actually reset properly because it would just freeze out. Like, it wouldn't post at that point because it was too cold. So, yeah, the CPU is just bloody great. I love this chip. I love it so much, I'm considering sending it right back because it is on loan. And trading it out for like a 7960X or maybe a 7980XE. Though at that point, I'd probably have to rerun these benchmarks. And that would use even more liquid nitrogen. And this already chewed up enough LN2 as is because the session took forever, and the CPU pulls a lot of power. Like, it pulls a lot of power all the damn time. So I ended up using like 40 liters of liquid nitrogen, which is just kind of insane. So yeah, that's the CPU side of it. The motherboard's great though. I love the motherboard. I really wish it had a slow mode, and I really wish it had a retry button. But other than that, the board was doing amazing, especially the memory side. Like, it really impressed me on the memory side. But the CPU is just, in my opinion, a pretty massive letdown there. Now, GPUs and power. So as you can see in the image, there's a power supply sitting outside the system, which is only 1200 watts. That power supply would not, survive running that system. So what's actually going on, there's inside the test bench, there's a 1600 watt EVGA G2 power supply that was powering the CPU and the Fury. So the air-cooled card in that, GPU sandwich, that air-cooled card was running off of the 1600 watt power supply. The other three cards were running off of the 1200 watt PSU. So that's a Corsair 1200 watt, HX 1200 watt. And then, everything else was on the G2 1600 watt. And the way you do a multi PSU setup like this is what you actually do is, so the VRM on a GPU will generally not fire up until the GPU is fed 3.3 volts. So what you do is you plug in, so from the Corsair power supply was basically feeding the three graphics cards just 12 volts, and it wasn't feeding them any other voltage. So those GPUs would have 12 volts on the input of the VRM, but until the MOSFETs turn on, that voltage isn't actually going anywhere. It's not going to do anything. So that power supply was just, had the power, what is it? PS on. Yeah, so the power supply on pin shorted to ground. So basically the same thing you would do if you were like testing a water cooling loop. I actually was using one of those EK jumper cable, jumpers for the 24 pin on that PSU. And so that PSU was actually also powering the fans, the ROG-OC panel, which I was using as a temperature monitor, as well as for the fan headers on it. So that 1200 watt power supply was powering the GPUs, and it was also powering the thermometer and the fans, well, some of the fans. And then the 1600 watt EVGA was powering the motherboard, the CPU, and one of the fourth graphics card. So that was the power setup. That's just generally how you run a multi-PSU setup. There's more elegant ways to do it, but they're fiddlier to set up. And if you're just benchmarking, this works just fine. Because I normally run a secondary power supply just for the fans and the ROG panel, ROG-OC panel anyway. Normally it's much smaller. It's like a 450 watt power supply that I use. But since I actually needed power for the graphics cards here, hey, here comes the 1200. So that's the power situation right there. And let's talk GPUs. So, as I said before, there's two Fury X's in there. There's and two Furies in there. The Furies, there's one Tri-X Fury, and there's one, which you can't see the Tri-X cooler, because what happened is I originally had three Fury X's, but I killed one of them by sneezing on the interposer. Something like that. Well, basically the interposer is extremely fragile. I cleaned it a little bit too aggressively. Interposer died. Great. Awesome. So that GPU just artifacts and is basically useless. So, at that point, it's like, okay, so, I'm not going to send it into RMA. That card had volt mods, had some modifications on it. There's no way it's getting past RMA. So the heatsink so the cooling system off of that Fury X ended up on the R9 Fury Tri-X card, and the reason why it ended up on the Tri-X card is that Tri-X card unlocks to 3,840 cores. In total, the system was running on 15,616 stream processors, which is just like awesome. That's a lot of freaking cores. The XFX card unfortunately doesn't unlock, so that's the fourth card. That one just had to run at 3584. And actually that's also my worst clocking Fury. Like out of all of the cards in there, that one clocks the worst. All the other cards can do like 1140, some of them can do even 1150 or 1160. But that last card does like a 1120 or 1130-ish at most. So that card's really like that was really holding back the system on the four-way setup. So when I ran the three-way setup, that was the card that I ended up disabling. And the other thing worth noting is that all of the cards had custom BIOSes, 500 watts power, 511 watts power limit, 511 amps current limit. Why did I choose 511? Well, because if you look into because I was doing it through a hex editor. So the power limit is a 2-byte value, and it goes 012C or 01C2, something like that. And basically 01FF is 511. And that's just a convenient value to punch in at that point. So 01FF, bam. Because ultimately your power limit is there to... like, here's the thing. The power limit is a limit. It's the rev limiter, okay? But if you put your... Well, okay, now, not really... Doesn't really work like a car analogy, does it? Basically, if the card doesn't need 1,000 watts, setting the power limit to 1,000 watts won't make it pull 1,000 watts. It just means if for some reason it did try to pull 1,000 watts, which it won't do, it could. So I just went and gave it a 511 watt power limit because that's an amount of power the Fury X will never ever pull. Well, actually, no, you can get them to pull that much power, but there's no good reason to do that because they don't scale that far with the voltage. And then the other thing I did in the BIOS was I actually modified the HBM memory timings from the 500 megahertz on the 500 megahertz strap. I was running the 400 megahertz timings. I was considering maybe making like fully custom timings, but I'm not that good at BIOS modding, and I didn't really want to, like, that would be a long, tedious battle with the memory timings. So I decided I don't want to bother with that. Ultimately, I don't think it would have made that much difference in terms of performance either. Now, an interesting thing was the driver situation. Turns out that the 18 like the latest AMD driver sucks for four-way Crossfire. It's so bad. Like, it is incredibly bad at four-way Crossfire. So what I ended up doing is I actually went from the latest driver all the way to 16.8.2. Why 16.8.2? Because I know for a fact that four-way Crossfire works okay on 16.8.2. Why? Because I ran three-way Crossfire on that driver in the past and it scored great. And the problem with the latest driver was that on the latest driver, I was getting scores that were like roughly in line with like... well, we're barely faster than a three-way setup. So I was like, well, there's a much older driver where I know this worked better. So I went to the 16.8.2 driver. Maybe a 17 series driver would have been better, but I couldn't be bothered to test. The 16.8.2 driver also had HBM overclocking, so I also ran all of the cards at 550 megahertz HBM clock, because they could sustain that. So yeah, that was how that was set up. So 16.8.2 driver, because that one actually ran four-way Crossfire. There might be a better four-way Crossfire driver, but at the time I was just like, I could not be bothered to hunt down a better driver. So that's how that went. Is there anything I'm forgetting at this point? I mentioned how much LN2 it used. I mentioned temperatures, voltages, cooling, BIOS, cards. Yeah, I've basically mentioned everything. So that's basically how the session went. I really enjoyed it. I really like that. I like I can take the system image off now. I really like benching big, ridiculous multi-GPU setups. It's the reason why it's like, why do I have two GTX 590s? Because they're ridiculous. So why do you bench four-way Crossfire? Because it's ridiculous. And I chose Vantage specifically because it looked like a benchmark where, with the 7940X and with how much GPU firepower I had, it looked like, yeah, this I'm gonna do well in this. It's gonna give me a lot of points, and so I won't feel like I'm wasting LN2 on it. Though I've done things like I ran the 2700X, like I poured LN2 on that on like an illegal operating system without any benchmarks I could actually run on it. So that was fun. But hey, that was just like, oh, I wanted to do that. But for the four-way setup, it was just like I actually wanted to get some decent scores. And so let's actually look at the scores. Bam. So this is the four-way score. 118,000 points. 5.65 gigahertz. Here's the screenshot. I'm using the ASRock CPU-Z version, but that's because that was the latest CPU-Z version I had installed on the system. And I couldn't be bothered to grab a newer one. I got a 4th place for the global score. And the main reason why I didn't, like, if we look at the top score, right, which is Smoke, here, he's getting like 128,000 points on the GPU and 135,000, almost 135,000 on the CPU. And he's on the 7980XE at like 5.74 gigahertz. So, yeah, I'm just like, I'm really losing on the CPU side there. I mean, my GPU score wasn't exactly incredible at what, 100,019. But the thing is, GT1, I think I could have picked up a few more GPU score points by just doing better in the first test, because that first test is super CPU bottlenecked. And actually, when I realized I was actually losing on GPU score, that's when I decided to do the BIOS updates. So I was actually doing the BIOS updates with the system on liquid nitrogen, which is part of why it used so much LN2. Is because I was updating the BIOS while on LN2, and after I updated the BIOS, the AMD drivers needed a reinstall, and yeah, that was not fun. But and quite a big waste of LN2 right there. But hey, this is just like that's what you do. It's like I wasn't going to tear down the system. At the time, I didn't know how much longer it would take me to get the scores I wanted, so it was just like, oh, I'm going to update the BIOS and everything's going to be great. And then after I updated the BIOSes, it's like I started really, like, and pushing further and further, I started to running into more and more, like, you know, I started running into the CPU issues again. Because it was like, oh, now the GPU score's good, but we need to pull the CPU up higher. And one thing that helped me with achieving the overall score is Kingpin actually gave me a tweak for 3Dmark Vantage, where basically what you do is you run the CPU tests with the benchmark limited to like set the benchmark affinity through just Task Manager. You just open up Task Manager and you set 3Dmark Vantage core affinity to 1 core, and then you run the CPU tests, and then you put the affinity to all cores again, and it boosts the score a little bit. It's like a couple thousand, 1,000 to 2,000, 2,000 to 3,000 points. Like it's a single thousand increase in score. But hey, it's just like, if we look at the rankings here, right, I'm at 118,000. The guy above me is at 119,000. So it's like if I had, another 2,000 more points, I'd be ahead of him. So, yeah, it's very, very close up at the top like this. And then Smoke is just miles and miles ahead of everybody because he's on 1080 Ti's while everybody else is on like 980 Ti's, 980 Ti's, 980s, more like Titan X's. The Maxwell Titan X is there, and then I'm there with the Fury X. Actually, I wonder where I'm pretty sure there's another Fury X score somewhere. Oh, there's 290X's. Is there no 4-way Fury X score? Really? Am I the only one who's run that? Because I know there's a guy there's another guy on HardwareBot who had 4 Fury X's. Interesting. So I'm the only guy who's run that. Wait, no, we can check that better. We can check that through... Oh, I am the only guy. Damn. Oh, well. That's kind of sad. Um, but, yeah. So at this point, I need more CPU power, and I do still need more GPU power. And honestly, on the GPU power side of things, I think putting the Fury X's under like extreme cooling would be a valid solution to that problem. The main issue is I don't have enough LN2 pots for 4-way yet. So, and also once I do 4-way, I'm not going to have enough liquid nitrogen. Like the amount of liquid nitrogen this score used up is insane. As I said, it's like I set out to burn 35 liters, and after I finished 35 liters, I still didn't have the scores I wanted. So I went and, grabbed, I think I grabbed another 5. There's a good chance I might have actually used more than that. I wasn't really keeping track at that point. I was just trying to get the scores over quick, so, I could be done with it. But yeah, so that's the 4-way score. The 3-way score, also a 4th place. Turns out, like, the 4-way score, like, the 3-way score, I got really, like, the GPUs, like, the CPU score is actually higher than my 4-way score because for the 3-way score, I had all of my memory channels, right? Like, I actually have quad channel running there. Whereas on the 4-way score, that score, the memory controller decided to be, a memory controller and dropped a memory channel. Like, this is one of the things with the the quad channel memory platforms, all of them, they have this habit of dropping memory channels. It's like X79 does it, X99 does it, X299 also does it. I think the worst of them is X99. Like, X99 is capable of dropping anything from all your, like, you can boot X99 and have, like, one memory channel running because that platform just hates memory. It makes Ryzen look kind of cute because Ryzen either boots or it doesn't. You can't get into Windows with, like, half your memory not working. But on X99, you can very easily get into Windows with, like, most of your memory slots not running at all. And X299 is not quite as bad. I never saw it drop all the way to, like, dual channel, just triple. So that's nice. It wouldn't drop half your memory, just 25%, but still rather annoying. So, at this point I ran out of patience and I was just like, oh, well, we're running it with triple and I can't be bothered anymore. And then for 3-way, I actually had the 4th memory channel, so the CPU score did a little bit better. There might also be, like, the fact that one of the GPUs went away might have also lightened the CPU workload a little bit, which might have also helped there. But I need to test in detail, like, test that, like scientifically test that, because this is really anecdotal, because it's not like I did the testing back to back and specifically restricted the variables to the things that I wanted to test. It was just like, oh, quad channel works and the CPU score is a bit higher. It makes sense to me that it would be because of the extra memory channel coming back. And then the GPU score went down quite significantly. You can actually see how, like, GPU test 1 is 285 FPS, which on the 4-way score, it's 292 FPS. So that's what I was talking about. That GPU test 1 is incredibly CPU bottlenecked. There's, like, no difference between the 3-way and almost no difference between 3-way and 4-way. But then you have GPU test 2 where, on the 4-way setup, I'm getting a 407 FPS. And on the 3-way setup, I'm only getting 346. So that really let down the 3-way setup, because I was really, like, on the 3-way run, I was really expecting to take first place. Because if you take a look at the first place for 3-way, it's not really that, like, it's not that fast, but it has way more GPU score, but way less CPU score. So I was basically hoping that the CPU would carry me, and I would just need to, I was hoping for something around like 115,000 GPU score. Maybe even more GPU score than the 4-way setup, just because, I don't know, like, it wouldn't have particularly surprised me if it turned out that with sometimes as you go up in GPU count, you actually lose FPS because the increase in CPU workload from adding an extra GPU is so big that at the really old benchmarks where you're getting like thousands of frames a second or hundreds of frames a second, as you add extra GPUs, your score goes down. Like Unigine Heaven does that. Like the 4-way world record is lower than the 3-way world record because 4-way puts so much more load onto the CPU than 3-way does. That 4-way is slower than 3-way at that point because the GPUs choke the CPU more and more as you keep adding them. But Vantage doesn't suffer from that. Vantage would have actually very much welcomed even more GPU firepower, which really annoys me because I was really hoping to take that first place, and then it's just like, oh, the Fury X's are slower than Admittedly, these are these are 1800 megahertz 980 Ti's, so it's not exactly surprising that they're just absolutely curb stomping my GPU score. But it's annoying because I was really hoping to get a easy gold, which I guess that, now if I take down this record, it will at least be, a bigger victory because it's not just the CPU carrying my slow ass to first place. I actually have to put some real, honestly, 40 liters and several hours of pounding away at the 7940X, I think, is a lot of effort, but I don't know. We can put more into it. We can always put more effort into it. Yeah, and I do want to still do it with the Fury X's just because I'm a massive AMD fanboy and I don't have enough records that are with AMD GPUs. Well, it's not so much that I'm a massive AMD fanboy, it's just I don't like Nvidia. So the more scores I can take on AMD GPUs, the better. So that's kind of that. So I need to get the Fury X's on liquid nitrogen and clock them up. The other thing is that the 980 Ti's actually run LOD for Vantage. Those can do the level of detail tweak. So it's not just that they have more, just more pixel pushing power. They also have the advantage of having to do less work because the textures are gone. But that really doesn't make that much of a difference. That's a couple percent. So yeah. Also, I do think I'm probably going to return the 7940X and get a 7960X or 7980XE. So I'm going to have more CPU firepower as well. So that's the future. I'm taking down that 3-way score, and maybe I don't know. I'd like to take down the 4-way record just because 4-way is just I love 4-way. Just it's so ridiculous, and that is reason enough for me to be yeah, I want to do 4-way. The problem is that's on 1080 Ti's, and I don't see myself picking up 4 of those anytime soon. But Nvidia doesn't seem to have any plans of supporting 4-way into the future. So as long as there's no as long as Nvidia doesn't put out a newer generation of GPUs that supports 4-way, I should be able to maybe in 3 years pick up 4 1080 Ti's and go and blow up that 4-way world record. Well, it's not a world record. It's a global first place because the actual world record for 3Dmark Vantage is set on 2 1080 Ti's and a 7980XE, if I'm not mistaken. And actually, the single GPU record is really, really, really close to the world record with 2 GPUs, which is just crazy because, yeah, 3Dmark Vantage is now so old that if you take the really, really modern cards, you run into the whole more cards, less score situation. Which I think you can kind of see on... Does Smoke score? Yeah, his GPU score is lower than that of a bunch of 980 Ti's in 3-way. So that already basically tells you what this is that already kind of shows you the negative scaling issue that you start getting as you pile on more and more graphics cards. But yeah, I still want to do 4-way just because it's so it's so insane. So yeah, that's it. This turned out to be way too damn long, but yeah, there was a lot to go over. So that was the 3-way 4-way session. It was really fun. It wasn't live stream, which I think made it more fun because I didn't have to worry about, you know, cameras, sound, video, internet connection. All of that was just like, I'm benching. I don't need to pay any attention to any of that, which was really, really nice. And yeah, that was an awesome session, and I just figured I'd talk about it because I don't know, I thought you'd be interested. Also, I'm hoping to inspire people to like go out and bench themselves. That's the master plan behind actually hardcore overclocking. We need more competitive overclockers because it's kind of because I like really niche hardware, and there's not enough people who like niche hardware that I like. So it's just like, maybe if I inspire enough people, I'll get to bench more people in four-way. You know, do like more people will bench things like GTX 590s and stuff, and other, you know, dual GPU cards and other ridiculous things, instead of just like whatever gets the most points. Because at the end of the day, as benchmarks get older, the best way to get most points is to run less cards, and is like, and the other thing is Nvidia and AMD are both dropping multi GPU support, and I'm just like, but I like burning 1,000 watts for one score, or several thousand watts, because once you overclock all the cards, the power consumption goes absolutely insane. Oh yeah, so that's it for the video. I don't know if anybody found this even remotely interesting, but hey, at least I got to enjoy benchmarking the 7940X. This motherboard, super, like X299 motherboards go, love this thing, best board ever. Unlike I do like it a lot, X299. It's just like the memory and the CPU cores issue is just like, that is an issue that made me hate X99. And I'm like, is it fair for me to say X299 is nice when it does the same thing that I hated X99 for so much? It doesn't do it as much. So I'm going to say it's fair. That's like, but that board is super solid, like awesome to work with. Made the session really, really fun. Wow. Really, really fun until it started lasting way too long and chewing up way too much LN2. But that moment when I finally got that, you know, 118,000 points, I was just like it's not even a world record. It was just like the CPU score and the GPU, because at that point it wasn't about like what was the final score going to be. It was just, I know what the GPUs can do. I know what the CPU can do. Now can I get them to just do them at the same time? And it was just like, it did it. Admittedly with triple channel, but it did it. And I was just like, yes, finally, I get my damn score. And then I got to go to do three-way, and three-way was a lot easier. So yeah, it was a pretty decent session, but needs more GPU power. And now I'll actually end the video because it's getting way too damn long. But yeah, thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, criticisms, suggestions, you can leave them down in the comment section below. And if it turns out you like this kind of summary, then I'll do more of them. And I don't want to say that would cut down on the live streams, but I personally don't enjoy, well, sometimes I enjoy live streaming, sometimes I don't, and it's just like, more often than not, I don't, just because it's a lot more stressful. But yeah, we'll see. Like, I do want to do more live streams because you know, they're cool, but at the same time they're just way more stressful, and I feel like I don't get, like, as far as actually getting scores goes, they're not as productive. So that's that. But anyway, I do want to hear your thoughts on the whole idea of this kind of content. It won't be super regular. It'll just basically be when I do a session that I don't want to live stream and think is worth talking about. And yeah, so that covers that. And then if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, so, you know, what does supporting mean? Well, it funds the LN2 and power supplies and graphics cards to abuse like this. I have a Patreon, I have a PayPal, there's also t-shirts you can buy. You're going to find a link to all of that down in the description below, and that does help out a ton. So, yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.